we become smarter by having a real conversation. Oftentimes, I don't know what I think until I have to explain it to you.
Mhm.
And if we're in a fight, if my goal is just to beat you, I'm not going to say anything new. I'm going to say the same things I've said many times. But if my goal is to really help you understand what I believe, suddenly I have to start figuring out how to explain it differently. And in doing so, I learn more about what I actually believe.
Mamilos Café.
Sejam bem-vindos ao Mamilos Café, o nosso espaço para receber mentes instigantes para conversas profundas e provocadoras. Hoje eu tenho o prazer de receber Charles Duhigg, que é autor e jornalista e se destaca por transformar os meandros do comportamento humano em insights poderosos e acessíveis. Ele é formado em História pela Universidade de Yale e tem um MBA pela Harvard Business School. É famoso pelo trabalho como repórter do New York Times, onde o talento para investigar temas complexos e relevantes rendeu o prestigiado Prêmio Pulitzer em 2013. Duhigg é o autor do best-seller O Poder do Hábito, publicado em mais de 40 países e com milhões de cópias vendidas, que explora como os nossos hábitos moldam as nossas vidas e como podemos transformá-los para alcançar resultados extraordinários. Tem muito mais livro. O que torna o trabalho de Duhigg tão fascinante é a habilidade que ele tem de combinar pesquisa científica com histórias reais, criando uma narrativa que não apenas informa, mas inspira a mudança. Hoje a gente tem esse privilégio enorme de receber ele aqui no Mamilos Café para uma conversa sobre o seu livro Super Comunicadores, lançado pelo selo Objetiva da Companhia das Letras. Welcome to Mamilos Café.
Thank you so much for having me. This is so much fun.
Eu vou começar com uma pergunta que a gente sempre faz, e eu preciso te dar um contexto do que ela significa, porque é uma expressão idiomática, tá? Eu quero saber quem é você na fila do pão.
Oh, that's interesting. That's interesting. And that's an expression in Brazil?
Yeah. A gente também usa, por exemplo, quem é você na noite?
Ah, right. It's a great question. I love this question because it's a deep question. In psychology, these are important questions that allow us to reveal who we are. So who am I when I'm waiting in a line? I think I'm the person who gets distracted, right? I have an idea. My wife tells me I do this all the time. I start thinking about something and then suddenly the line moves and I don't notice that it's moving. And then I might turn to the person behind me and tell them, I'm having this idea, and they have no idea who I am. So I think that's who I am. I'm the person who gets lost in my ideas sometimes.
Very good. Você já falou sobre hábitos e produtividade. O que te inspirou, o que te despertou curiosidade para mergulhar agora em estudos sobre comunicação?
I think that communication is the most important thing on earth right now, right? We are living during this time when we are more polarized than ever before. And because of social media, because of our politics, it's really hard sometimes to hear what other people are trying to tell us. It's very hard to connect with us. And when I was writing The Power of Habit, one of the things that came across was I would get emails from readers who said, "Thank you so much for your book. I feel like it helped me change my life, but now I need to change other people's habits. How do I change the habits of the people who are driving me crazy?" And what I realized is a huge portion of life is other people, right? When we're at work, we work on teams. When we're at home, it's our marriage and our families that determine how happy we are. And at the core of every single one of those is communication. That if you can communicate well with the people around you, then everything goes well. And if you can't communicate well, then nothing goes well. And so I wanted to understand, why are some people better at communication than others? What's the secret that they learned that makes them a super communicator?
Pois é, então já começa falando isso. O que é super comunicador? O que é isso?
So I'll ask you a question to sort of show what a super communicator is. If you were having a bad day and you came home from work and you wanted to call someone or talk to someone who you know would make you feel better, do you know who that person would be?
Yes.
Who is it?
Carol?
Carol.
Yes.
Okay. Carol, for you, is a super communicator.
She really is.
And when you talk back to her, you're a super communicator for her. right? And everyone who's listening, they've had the same experience, that there's someone in your life who just talking to them makes things feel better. Now, what's interesting, though, is that the skills that Carol is using with you, that she might not even be aware that she's using, and the skills that you're using back, that you might not see them as skills, those are skills that you can use with anyone. You could talk to any coworker the same way you talk to Carol. You could talk to a stranger on the bus the same way you talk to Carol. And what you would find is that they would open up for you.
Então você está falando, porque assim, a gente imagina quando a gente pensa em super comunicadores, em grandes políticos, em grandes professores, a gente não está pensando em pessoas comuns da nossa vida, do nosso cotidiano. Se você vai para além desse estereótipo, dessa expectativa, o que esses super comunicadores têm em comum?
It's a really good question. And usually what they have in common are three basic skills, right? So the first one is like the question you asked. Super communicators, we're all super communicators at one time or another, but people who are consistent super communicators, they tend to ask more questions than the average person, 10 to 20 times as many questions, a lot of questions. And some of those questions are questions that we hardly even notice are questions like, oh, what'd you think about that? Or what'd you say next? Right? They're invitations to us to participate in the conversation. But some of the questions are deep questions. And a deep question is something that asks about our values or our beliefs or our experiences. And that can sound a little intimidating, but it's as simple as like if you meet a doctor, instead of saying, oh, what hospital do you work at? Saying, oh, what made you decide to go to medical school? Right? Do you like being a doctor? Oh, you live in Paulista. Like, not like, oh, what street do you live on? But instead, what made you decide to move to Paulista? What do you like about it? When we ask those deep questions, we're inviting someone else to tell us who they really are. And that's really, really powerful. So that's the first big skill.
And the next two?
So the next two are, when I ask you a deep question, it's important that I listen to you, but I also have to show you that I'm listening to you. One of the things that we know about listening is that listening is not a passive activity. I might absorb all the words you're saying, but unless I show you that I'm listening, you don't believe that I'm listening. And so I need to do things like ask you follow-up questions. I need to share some things about myself, to say, if you say, oh, I went to Barcelona and I loved it so much, to say, oh, I went to Barcelona too. We loved it. It was a little hard because like, well, we have young kids, but I need to show you that I'm paying attention. And this is particularly important in conflicts, right? If you or I disagree with something, if we're talking about something hard, at those moments, proving that I'm listening becomes critical. And there's actually a technique for this known as looping for understanding. It has 3 steps. Step 1 is ask a question, preferably a deep question. Step 2 is after you answer that question, repeat back what I heard you say in my own words. Prove to you that I'm paying attention. Prove to you that I'm thinking about it. And then step 3, and this is the step I always forget, is ask if I got it right. You know, I think what you said was, am I hearing you right? Am I getting that?
Mhm.
Because when we do that, what we're actually doing is we're asking someone else for permission to acknowledge that we were listening. And when they give that acknowledgement, they become more likely to listen to us in return. It's baked into our neurology. It's a
Faz
reciprocation.
sentido.
Yeah. So that's the second skill.
And the last one?
The last one's a little bit more complicated. So one of the things that we've learned about discussions and communication is that when we're having a discussion, we tend to assume that it's about one thing, right?
I love that
We're
part.
talking about our kids. We're talking about where to go on vacation. We're talking about our day. But what we know is that every discussion is made up of different kinds of conversations, right? And this feels so true when you hear it. And in general, these conversations, they tend to fall into one of 3 buckets. There's practical conversations where we talk about making plans or solving problems. But then there's emotional conversations where if I tell you what I'm feeling, I don't want you to solve my feelings.
Sorry.
I'm not asking you to solve my problems. I just want you to hear me. I want you to empathize.
Hard for me. Okay.
And then there's social conversations, which is about how we relate to each other and how we relate to society. And what's important is having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. So the third thing that super communicators do is they listen for clues about what kind of conversation the other person wants to have, and then they match them, and they invite them to match back. And once we get aligned, then we can move from emotional to practical to social back to emotional. But as long as we're moving together, we'll hear each other much, much better.
Eu quero aprofundar mais nisso, porque foi, acho que uma parte que eu amei, porque assim, você dá um exemplo maravilhoso no livro de conversas frustrantes que você teve com a sua esposa, e eu acho que todo mundo que lê pensa num exemplo que teve na semana de uma conversa assim, que é a típica conversa de, mas não é sobre isso que eu tô falando.
Right.
Sabe? Sempre acontece, sempre acontece. E a gente tá sempre tendo essa discussão. Eu tô tentando resolver com meu marido quem que vai pegar as crianças na escola, e ele tá falando comigo sobre como parece que eu não valorizo o tempo dele, que parece que só porque ele tá em casa, o tempo dele é menos importante. E a gente tá falando de coisas diferentes e a gente fica assim, crianças então eu queria que você me ajudasse a ficar mais tempo casada. Eu gosto dele, viu? Gosto bem. Queria ficar mais tempo casada. Me ajuda, como é que eu consigo, primeiro, entender que conversa que é? E segundo, eu realmente preciso decidir quem vai pegar as crianças na escola. Como é que eu faço ele conversar sobre o assunto da conversa?
Yeah. Okay, this is a great question. This is a great question because it comes up all the time. It comes up in my marriage all the time, right? I come home from work and I start complaining about my day. My boss doesn't understand me. And my wife will say, oh, well, here's a solution. Why don't you take your boss out to lunch and get to know each other? And instead of hearing what she's saying, I get even more frustrated, right? I say, why aren't you outraged on my behalf? Why aren't you listening to me? The same way that your husband says, I don't want to talk. So what's happening there is that I and your husband are having emotional conversations, right? We might not use emotional words, but what we're saying is, I feel like you don't take my time seriously. I feel hurt. I feel like you owe me something more, and it hurts me that I don't get it. And you and my wife are having practical conversations. You're saying, I don't care about fairness. I don't care about like your feelings. We just got to figure out who's going to take the kids to school. We have to make a decision. So how do we deal with this? How do we make this better? The first thing that we can do is when something comes up, we can just ask our spouse or anyone, what kind of conversation do you want to have? When I come home and I start complaining about my day, my wife will often say, do you want me to help you figure out a solution to this? Or do you just need to complain and get this off your chest? And usually I say, like, I just need to complain. Like, this isn't that big a deal. It's just like driving me crazy. I just want to complain and I need you to listen to me. And then at some point, my wife will usually say, I think I understand how you feel. And she'll repeat back what I told her. And then she'll say, can we think about solutions now? Can we think about how to solve it? And she's asking permission. Can we move from an emotional to a practical conversation? And I, of course, am like, oh, of course. Yeah, that's fine. Because we're moving together.
Ok. Vamos ver se eu entendi direito. Não dá pra gente resolver a questão em jogo enquanto a gente não lidar com os sentimentos envolvidos ou enquanto a gente não dá conta da questão social, que é como eu sou percebido pelo meu grupo, que eu acho que no trabalho, por exemplo, é uma grande coisa. Se eu acho que tá em jogo, se as pessoas acham que eu sou competente ou não, eu vou ser muito mais resistente à conversa prática do que tem que ser resolvido. Então, primeiro a gente lida com esses dois polos da conversa, para depois, quando tiver todo mundo na mesma página, aí a gente consegue resolver quem leva as crianças para a escola, quem vai receber o budget. Aí a conversa prática pode acontecer melhor.
That's absolutely, and that was a very good job of looping for understanding. You showed me that you're paying attention, but you're exactly right. Oftentimes, and sometimes we sit down and we both want to have a practical conversation, right? Where are we going to go on vacation? Okay, it's a practical conversation. But oftentimes when we sit down for what feels like a practical conversation, there's a lot of emotions there. There's a lot of social dynamics there. And if we pretend they don't exist, they corrupt the conversation. They make it impossible to hear each other. But if we say, look, I want you to know, your time is as important to me as my time is. I think that we Let's talk about who's going to pick up the kids. I want to do this in as fair a way as possible. And I know that you have a work trip coming up. And so you'll probably be distracted. Would it work for you? Is it okay if I propose that I go on Monday and Tuesday and you go on Wednesday, and then we'll figure out Thursday that day? At that moment, what I'm doing is and hopefully I'll be asking questions. Hopefully it's not just one way, right? But what I'm doing is I'm acknowledging that there is more than a practical conversation here. I'm inviting you to tell me how you feel. And then once that's on the table, then we can choose to become practical together. But it feels like we're both choosing together.
O que eu vejo? Eu acho que a gente é muito sensível para perceber quando o outro está se desviando da conversa prática. E, eu vou precisar lidar com seus sentimentos, eu vou ter que cuidar da sua... Sabe? E a gente não percebe quando a gente está demandando essas coisas também. E com as trocas que a gente tem feito cada vez mais com computador, com inteligência artificial, com máquina, enfim, a gente tem essa falsa coisa de que, o humano dá muito trabalho, né? Porque eu falo para Alexa, eu não preciso pensar qual é o tom que eu falo. Alexa, liga a luz, Alexa, faz isso. Gente, dá muito trabalho. Cada vez mais eu escuto isso. Eu vou ter que lidar com as suas emoções, não é só te pedir para fazer um trabalho. O que você acha disso? Porque quando você faz um livro para Super Comunicadores, você está convidando as pessoas a se interessar pelo outro e para assumir esse trabalho que é lidar com um humano. Sim, você vai ter que ter muita conversa antes de falar sobre o que você quer.
No, it's absolutely true. And just because we're inviting people to talk about themselves doesn't mean that it's okay to make this into like a sob session, right? Where everyone's crying on each other's shoulders. If I go to talk to my boss, then if I'm feeling something, I should share that. But if it's not important, he probably wants to have a conversation, or she wants to have a conversation about something practical. The same way that if I go in to ask for a raise and they start talking about how they feel about raises and what it was like for them when they were young, and I don't want to hear that. I want to know how I can go about getting a raise. So the question is, how do we become aligned? Because it doesn't matter what kind of conversation we're having. What matters is that we're having the same kind of conversation at the same moment. And sometimes that means sitting down and saying, I need to talk to you about something, and I know that this can be emotional, but I want to set aside the emotions for a moment, and let's talk about the practicalities. And sometimes it means sitting down and saying, hey, I need to talk to you about something like the budget. And let me just tell you, I know that discussing the budget is going to bring up a lot of feelings for both of us. It's okay to mention those feelings, because the only way that we kind of put them to the side is to say what you're feeling. When we're very deliberate about what kind of conversation we're having, when we tell the other person what we want and ask them what they want, that's when it becomes less work.
Perfeito, eu amo essa parte do livro, eu acho ótima. Tem uma outra parte que você fala sobre, para a gente entender em que conversa que a gente está, para a gente entender melhor o que a pessoa está nos dizendo, para ouvir melhor, você fala um pouco sobre as dicas não verbais. E para mim, especialmente, isso é muito genial, porque eu tenho muita dificuldade com essa parte. Eu escuto só as letras, só as palavras. Eu vou te contar uma história, já que você gosta de história, de como eu tive a grande iluminação do que eu estava perdendo dessas dicas. Eu estava lendo um HQ, eu não tenho costume de ler HQ, e ele era super moderno, sei lá, e eu não estava conseguindo entender. E aí eu perguntei pro meu marido, eu falei, como que eu sei qual é a ordem? Porque tem uns que são assim, tem uns que são assim, como é que eu sei? Ele não entendeu a pergunta, ele falou, você segue, né? O que acontece? Como eu só lia, eu não conseguia entender
Interesting.
que eu faço a mesma coisa numa conversa. Eu só estou escutando o que você está dizendo. Eu não estou vendo se você está nervoso, eu não estou vendo se você está balançando o pé, eu não estou vendo outras dicas, entendeu? Eu estou ouvindo só o que você está me dizendo. Então eu queria que você tenha algum insight sobre como a gente pode melhorar essa habilidade?
So let me ask you a question. When when your husband told you, oh, just start looking for the flow, did you start doing that? Was it easy to adapt? It's okay, right? It's because somebody drew your attention to it.
Mhm.
And so the question is, how do we draw our attention to people's body language when we're having a conversation with them? And one thing that I try and do is I'll stop when someone's speaking to me. What I'll do is I look at their face because their face is very expressive, but I also look at their body. Are their arms crossed? Are they are they relaxed? Do they seem upset or do they not seem upset? I just ask myself these questions in the back of my head. And then one of the things that I try and pay attention to is how do they respond to my words? And sometimes we can get confused. We think that when someone's interrupting us, that's a bad sign, but it's not. It's a good sign. It means that they're paying attention, that they want to participate, they want to contribute to the conversation. Sometimes when we see someone who's just going, just looking off, we think, oh, they must be listening very closely, but they're not. Listening is an active activity. And so if we just remind ourselves to look for clues, if we treat ourselves like a detective that says, I understand the words that are coming out of your mouth, but part of my brain wants to figure out, what are you feeling right now? Are you feeling happy? Are you feeling sad? Are you feeling frustrated? Are you feeling relaxed? Just reminding ourselves to pay attention often does the trick. It's like reading the comic book. Once someone points it out to you, it's obvious what to do. And so we have to point it out to ourselves to make it easier.
Perfeito. Tanto essa habilidade quanto a habilidade de fazer perguntas, ela requer que a nossa atenção esteja voltado para o outro. E eu acho que muito dos nossos erros de comunicação é porque a gente está muito preocupado com o que a gente vai dizer. Então eu vou chegar nessa entrevista tão tensa, pensando no que eu tenho que performar, em tudo que eu li, eu queria muito te fazer as perguntas boas, que eu perco o timing do que está acontecendo aqui. O que eu senti do seu livro é que tem muito do estar presente no momento, e muitas vezes a gente está preso dentro da nossa cabeça.
Yeah.
Você tem alguma dica de como a gente pode melhorar? Eu acho que primeiro a gente tem que lidar com a gente para depois estar pronto para o encontro, porque eu acho que essa é a dificuldade maior, não é?
I think one of the big things is to remember what the point of a conversation is. When I have a conversation with you, the goal is not to convince you that I'm right and you're wrong, or I'm smart, or that you should like me. The goal of a conversation is to understand how you see the world and to speak in such a way that you can understand how I see the world. And if we walk away disagreeing with each other, if we walk away saying, that person's an idiot, I never want to talk to them again, if we understand each other, then the conversation was a success. And so you're right. It's hard sometimes to be present. It's hard sometimes to forget about ourselves. So one of the techniques that I use is when I'm talking to someone, I think to myself, I want to listen so closely that I can repeat back to them what they're saying better than they can tell me themselves. That looping for understanding, I want that to be a habit. Because what happens is, if that's my goal, if I have to pay it close enough attention, I stop thinking about myself. I stop thinking about how am I going to impress you. I suddenly start thinking about like, oh, what's a question I need to ask to understand what you're really saying. And you feel that attention, right? You feel that attention and you want to give that attention back. It feels good. So you start asking me questions. The best conversations, if you look at them in a transcript, they look terrible. They look like they look like messes, right? You know this because you read transcripts all the time. When we have a great conversation, we're not eloquent. We don't speak in complete thoughts. Sometimes we start sentences and then we say something else and we get lost. But that's the sign of a good conversation, because instead of thinking about saying the perfect thing, I'm listening to you. You're listening to me. We're responding to each other.
Uhum.
A great conversation looks like a mess on paper, but it feels wonderful.
Então, olha só, eu acho que no Mamilos Debate, a gente, tanto eu quanto a Cris, nós somos super comunicadoras. A gente consegue fazer isso com maestria, a gente faz isso há 10 anos, tem um talento aí todo incrível. Só que isso não necessariamente se traduz na nossa vida pessoal. Não necessariamente eu uso essas skills todas na nossa vida pessoal. E eu achei isso brilhante de você falar no livro, de que assim, poxa, um jornalista, ele sabe se comunicar, como assim ele tá com problemas de comunicação? E direto, quando o meu marido também é jornalista, quando a gente tá tendo muita dificuldade de conversar, eu falo pra ele, isso que é tudo comunicador aqui em casa, né? Aí eu falo, comunica, isso é o que você sabe fazer, é o seu trabalho, vai lá, fala. A gente pode ser super comunicador e ao mesmo tempo péssimo ao mesmo tempo?
No, you can't. When you're not hearing each other, it's not necessarily because you're not a super communicator. It's because you're not asking yourself to use those skills, right?
Eu acho que depois de 12 anos de casamento, a gente já sabe exatamente o que é que a gente quer resolver e o que a gente só quer brigar.
Sometimes sometimes you don't want to have a conversation, right? Sometimes when my kids come to me and I say, I want to have a conversation about cleaning a room, I don't actually want to have a conversation about cleaning their room. I just want them to clean their room. And it's okay. It's okay not to have conversations. You never are obligated to have a conversation that you don't want to have. But
Good point.
when you do want to have a conversation, it's really useful to have the right skills to do it. Because sometimes you and your husband just want to fight. You want to you blow off steam, get it out there. But sometimes you want to be able to say, look, honey, it's really important to me that you wake up early on Saturday. Let me explain to you why. And when we know how to use those tools, that's when we can have the conversations we want to have. And then we can fight the rest of the time.
Very good. Peraí. Quando a gente fala da importância da conexão para uma boa comunicação, principalmente em ambientes corporativos, a gente geralmente recebe umas viradas de olho, porque as pessoas percebem como uma coisa meio hippie, abraçadora de árvore, essa coisa de vulnerabilidade no meio corporativo, muito ridículo. Eu achei que você fez um trabalho ótimo em tirar a dimensão mística da conexão e trazer para o prático, para o tangível. Você pode falar um pouco sobre a neurociência por trás da conexão?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so let's talk about what happens when we're in a conversation, like right now. Neither of us are paying attention to it or even aware of it, but our breath rates have started to match each other. Our heart rates have started to match each other. The pupils of our eyes are dilating at a similar rate. And most importantly, the activity inside our brains is looking more and more similar. And this makes sense when you think about it, because if I tell you about an emotion I'm feeling, you actually experience that emotion a little bit. If I tell you about an idea that I had, you experience that idea. So it makes sense that our brains become similar. Within neuroscience, this is known as neural entrainment, and it's the whole goal of communication. Our brains have evolved to feel wonderful when we're entrained with another person. That's why when you call your friend, it feels so good because you become entrained with Carol. So the question is, in a workplace, how do we become entrained, right? Because we don't want to cry on each other's shoulders. We don't want to have all these emotional conversations. We have business to get done. We have to get down to work. Well, one of the things that we know is that vulnerability is actually different than we think it is. We think of vulnerability as this thing where I have to cry on your shoulder, or I have to admit something deep and dark about myself. That's not vulnerability. What vulnerability is when I say something that you might judge and you choose not to judge me.
Mhm.
So if I tell you, I think Star Trek is better than Star Wars. Now, I might not care if you agree with me or not, but when you say, oh, that's interesting, tell me why. Or, I guess I feel a little bit differently, but I could see why you say that. When you decline to judge me, it automatically feels good. The vulnerability is expressing something that you could judge.
Mhm.
The reciprocation is you not judging it, and then perhaps sharing something about yourself. And in work, we can do this all the time, right? We walk into a meeting and we say, okay, we got to work on the budget. Just want to say, I'm kind of nervous about the budget because I really want to avoid layoffs.
Mhm.
I've said something vulnerable. I'm nervous. And if you say, I understand that nervousness. Like, I feel a little bit the same way, but we have to cut the budget. There might be layoffs. Now we feel closer to each other. Now we're becoming neurally entrained. And so this is the key, is to share who we are. And when someone shares with us, to share back. And it doesn't have to be big. It could just be asking a follow-up question. It could be saying, oh, I feel the same way. But when we're vulnerable and that vulnerability is reciprocated, we can't help but feel closer to the other person.
Tá, mas isso implica em correr riscos. Então, eu vou dar alguns exemplos que se dá no livro, por exemplo, do recrutador da CIA. Ele abre um potencial fracasso, falência dele, com informações que a pessoa poderia usar contra ele, ou que poderiam prejudicar a conversa futura com essa pessoa, mesmo que nessa situação ele já não tinha mais planos com a pessoa. Mas assim, em outros exemplos, agora não tá me vindo na cabeça que você deu, eu olhei e a Cris, minha sócia, que é uma pessoa super privada, ela me mataria se eu compartilhasse essas informações com uma pessoa. E eu acho que, para além de personalidades diferentes, numa cultura de coach, que você tem que projetar sucesso, você não mostra seus medos, seus erros e tal, como é que você pode defender tomar tanto risco?
I think we take that risk all the time without even thinking about it. So you're right. Chris is a private person. You shouldn't tell me Chris's secrets. But when Chris is talking to you, she probably shares things with you. And that's a risk. You guys are business partners. Maybe things are good today, but maybe they're not so good tomorrow. The more she shares with you, the more you could take advantage of it, right? And when I go to my boss and I tell my boss, I'm feeling this way about something, maybe my boss will hold it against me, but you don't see the reward unless you take a little bit of risk. And you know what? The risk is never as big as we think it is, right? You know that when Chris tells you something personal, it's not something you're going to use against her. You wouldn't even know how to use it against her. We perceive risks that don't actually exist. And we do this all the time. If you ask people, how much do you think you'll enjoy speaking to a stranger? Get on the bus, have a conversation with a stranger. Do you think you'll enjoy it? They say, no, it'd be terrible. Will it be awkward? Yes, it will be very, very awkward. And then they actually do it. You tell them, okay, you have to go have a conversation. You ask them afterwards how it was. And they say, that was actually amazing. Like I knew nothing about this person. And like, I feel like I know so much about them now. We perceive risks in conversation that aren't real. And it's not the conversation that's dangerous. It's our misguided expectations of the conversation. So I would say to people at work, at other places, you should take that risk. Now, that doesn't mean you should take selfish risks. If I'm at work and I'm feeling really upset, I should not go tell my boss every single day about all of my problems and what it's like with my boyfriend or my girlfriend and how I'm doing. You still have to understand what communication is appropriate in which setting. But if I go to my boss and I say, I'd like to ask you about getting a raise, and let me say at the outset, I'm kind of nervous to do this, but I think this is important to me and I want to share it with you. That's a risk, but it's going to work. Your boss is going to listen to you. And you might not get the raise, but they'll understand why you want the raise. It is almost always worth taking that risk because the risk isn't as big as you think it is, and the rewards are even bigger than you anticipate.
Já que a gente está falando de risco, eu queria que a gente entrasse um pouco em conversas difíceis, porque você se debruça bastante sobre isso, né? São conversas em que a confiança não está necessariamente estabelecida, ou em que o respeito sequer necessariamente está estabelecido. Quando a gente vai conversar com pessoas que têm vivências, valores diferentes dos nossos, o que deveria mudar na nossa comunicação nesses contextos?
It's a really good question. And there's two things that we know from research and studies makes a difficult conversation better. The first is to acknowledge upfront that it's a difficult conversation. And the way to do that is to say, look, I want to talk to you about something, and I think that this is going to be a hard conversation because we disagree with each other. And I just want to acknowledge it's going to be a little bit awkward, and that's okay. And also, I might say the wrong thing, right? in the gap between my brain and my lips,
Mhm.
I might mean to say one thing and it comes out wrong and maybe even offensive. And I hope that you'll forgive me if I do that. And I want to promise you that if you do that, if you say the wrong thing, I'll forgive you. Like, I'm not going to hold this against you. Okay, so the first thing that we've done is we've set the table to say, this is a tough conversation and it's okay to feel anxious, to make mistakes.
Mhm.
Then when we start discussing whatever we want to discuss, that's when that looping for understanding becomes critical.
Mhm.
Because if you think that I'm just waiting my turn to speak, you're telling me why you like one candidate and you know I like the different candidate. And I'm just listening to you and you think in the back of your head, she's just waiting her own turn to speak,
Mhm.
right? How do I change that suspicion? I change that suspicion by saying, okay, I really want to understand what you're saying. What I heard you say is you like this candidate because you believe that you feel unsafe and that this candidate is for safety. Am I getting that right? Am I doing that correctly? At that moment, we've done two things. Number one, I've proven to you that I'm listening.
Mhm.
So you're going to become more willing to listen to me. Number two, I've found something that we do have in common. We all know what it feels like to feel unsafe.
Mhm.
Right? And that doesn't mean that necessarily I want to vote for your guy or you want to vote for my guy. But because we both know what it's like to feel unsafe, we now have a place to begin to understand each other.
Mhm.
So in those hard conversations, it's really important to say up front, this is going to be a hard conversation. I'm going to try and say everything right, but I might not, and I apologize in advance. But I will listen to you as hard as I can, and I will try and understand you, and I'll prove it to you.
Mhm.
That's how we make those hard conversations easier.
Eu acho demais que você consegue colocar um framework para explicar por que o que a gente faz é tão bom. Porque como que a gente há 10 anos faz isso num ambiente muito polarizado no Brasil? O convite que a gente faz é: você vai sentar na mesa com pessoas que pensam diferente, partindo do pressuposto que a pessoa que eu coloquei aqui, que eu escolhi colocar aqui, é inteligente e bem-intencionada. Só senta nessa mesa gente inteligente e bem-intencionada. A gente não vai conversar para mudar a opinião de ninguém. A gente senta para a partir da sempre a mesma pergunta: como que uma pessoa inteligente e bem-intencionada pode estar olhando para os mesmos fatos que eu e chegar numa conclusão tão diferente? Não é para a gente mudar de ideia, para eu sair daqui entendendo mais de você, da questão, porque você vai me trazer coisas que eu não teria olhado, e no final de mim, porque o jeito que eu vou falar para conseguir te explicar o que eu penso vai acabar me ajudando a entender mais sobre mim. É sobre isso. A gente começa assim, que eu acho que é a primeira parte que você falou. E a segunda coisa, eu acho que quem faz esse looping somos nós na conversa, na mediação. Então, em todos os programas você vai ver que depois que a pessoa fala, a gente vai lá e faz organiza para que a gente não tenha espantalhos na conversa. Que é quando você está se referindo a uma coisa que o outro lado nunca falou, ele não pensa, é uma distorção da ideia do outro lado. Isso a gente faz na mediação. Então acho muito legal que a gente sempre fez isso de uma forma muito empírica, muito instintiva, e quando eu vejo o jeito que você explica, é exatamente o que a gente faz, só que está explicado.
I mean, I think you guys are clearly super communicators, but more importantly, you're teaching other people how to be super communicators, right? You're serving as a model, and you're exactly right. Sometimes super communicators, the best super communicators, they're not just speaking what they think. They're helping translate between people. There was an experiment that was done that looked at groups of people who had watched video clips together, and then they had to discuss what happened in the video clip. Some of the groups came to consensus very, very quickly. Some of the groups felt very close to each other. And what they discovered is that in those groups, there was at least one person who was a super communicator. And what that person did, it's not that they had so many ideas, it's that they repeated other people's ideas. And in fact, the super communicator was far more influential than anyone else in the group, but nobody even recognized that. Nobody realized in the group how influential they were because they would always say, oh, Jim brought up this interesting idea. Like, I want to say, let me repeat your idea, just make sure I'm getting it right. And when we do that, we're actually helping Jim be a better communicator. We love people like that. We crave people like that. We crave people like the service you provide because it helps us understand each other and it serves as a model for how to be a better person.
No capítulo que você deu esse exemplo, eu fiquei pensando também numa lógica de por que que o Mamilos é assim. Porque o que você estava descrevendo, essa pessoa que faz a tradução, estava descrevendo muito uma dinâmica de design sprint, que era o trabalho que eu e a Cris tínhamos antes de fazer o Mamilos. Então, que basicamente é pegar um workshop de criação, de cocriação e criar um ambiente em que as pessoas pudessem trazer as suas ideias, ter certeza que eu consegui escutar as ideias de todo mundo e facilitar para que as ideias se combinassem da melhor maneira possível. É um outro jeito de fazer o que a gente faz hoje no final.
Well, and what I love about what you had said previously that I think is such a beautiful, beautiful statement is oftentimes, not only do I understand what you're trying to tell me, I actually understand myself better by
Mhm.
trying to explain it to you,
Mhm.
right? When I listen to you and when I participate in this conversation, when we have this design sprint, I'm not just benefiting because I hear your perspective. Oftentimes, I don't know what I think until I have to explain it to you.
Mhm.
And if we're in a fight, if my goal is just to beat you, I'm not going to say anything new. I'm going to say the same things I've said many times. But if my goal is to really help you understand what I believe, suddenly I have to start figuring out how to explain it differently. And in doing so, I learn more about what I actually believe. I think it's incredibly important. I often don't know what I think until I sit down with my wife and I talk it over with my wife. And I'm a pretty smart guy. I should be able to figure it out on my own. But we think through communication.
Mhm.
And when we have those real conversations, we're not only helping the other person, we're not only helping the world, we're helping ourselves. We become smarter by having a real conversation.
Então, geralmente quando as pessoas vêm buscar: "Ah, eu preciso melhorar minha comunicação", as pessoas estão buscando um jeito de, expressar melhor o que elas pensam. Então elas estão preocupadas com a parte de falar da comunicação. E você traz muito a necessidade do ouvir melhor, ser, um ouvinte ativo. Eu acho, desses 10 anos que a gente faz o podcast, que a nossa habilidade de ouvir está diminuindo cada vez mais. Como você vê o impacto da tecnologia nessa diminuição da disponibilidade para escutar o outro? Essa coisa da velocidade 1.5 no áudio de WhatsApp, no vídeo 1.5. Como você acha que isso impacta?
It, it does if you let it. So the truth of the matter is social media is here to stay, right? YouTube is here to stay. WhatsApp is here to stay. We're not going to get rid of it. So the question is, how do we use it in a better fashion? And let me tell you a little story I think is interesting. So about 100 years ago, when telephones first became popular, there were all these studies that appeared that said, no one will ever have a real conversation on the telephone, right? Because up until then,
Eu
all
vi.
conversations had happened face to face. And they said, if you can't see the person, if you can't hear the tone of their voice, if you can't see their gestures, you'll never have a real conversation. And what's interesting is at that moment and for the next 15 years, they were right. If you look at early transcripts of telephone conversations, people didn't know how to talk on the phone.
Hmm.
They would use it like a telegraph. They would call up and say, here's my grocery order, and then hang up, right? They would say, here's what the stocks I want to buy. And the broker would ask a question and they would say, okay, and then hang. We didn't know how to use phones. Now, by the time you and I and our kids are in middle school, they can talk on the phone for 7 hours a night, right? We know how to have a phone. And what's interesting is we've learned the rules of phone conversations, even if we don't recognize them as rules, even if we don't realize it. When you're on the phone, on average, you over-enunciate your words by about 30%. You put about 37% more emotion into your voice. Now, you don't realize you're doing this, but some part of your brain knows they can't see my expressions. I have to put the expressions in my voice. Our technology today, social media, these different ways of communicating, we're like those early telephone users. We're learning how to use them. And it's hard, right? It's hard. Sometimes we learn the wrong lessons. But if we slow down and we remind ourselves of the lessons, and it's so easy when you're standing online to pull out your phone and just start scrolling through it, right? But if you say, okay, once a day, when I'm gonna stand online and I'm not gonna look at my phone. I'm just gonna let myself just think or daydream or be bored. I'm just gonna do it once a day. What you'll find is you start doing it automatically. It becomes a habit, and you start having deeper thoughts, and you start being more present and more mindful. We are the habits that we train ourselves to have. And when we give in to the nonsense, the thing that we know is not good for us, but it's just so easy, we're teaching ourselves a habit for that. And when we say, just once a day, I'm going to be bored and stand online and not look at my phone, we start building that habit too. So I'm not worried about technology because I think in the long run, we will learn how to use it. And you mentioned your kids are teenagers,
12 and 10.
12 and 10. And do they have phones yet, or are they?
Only the 12.
Okay. So at some point, if you dare, ask the 12-year-old to show you his text messages. And what you'll see is that they use texting completely different from you and I. They send each other messages that are nothing but a string of emojis. Those are emotional conversations, right? They've learned how to use texting. They've learned how to express emotions to their friends through text. And because it's not as native to us, it's not as natural. But the more we think about it, the more we train ourselves to have the habits that we want, the better we become at communicating.
Eu adoro essa visão otimista do mundo. O William Woody esteve aqui e a gente ama ele, né?
He's wonderful.
E a gente perguntou para ele se ele era otimista ou pessimista, e ele falou: eu sou possibilista. Que eu acho que a resposta que você me deu é possibilista. A gente tem possibilidades de fazer melhor. Se a gente vai ou não, são escolhas, mas tem possibilidades de fazer melhor. Já que a gente estava falando de conexão, né, do online, que a gente está aprendendo a se conectar com outra mediação, com outra tecnologia mediando, eu queria só voltar um passo e perguntar uma coisa que ficou para trás, que é o seguinte: quando a gente fala que eu vou me conectar com a pessoa, eu vou entender o que ela está sentindo e eu vou responder na mesma frequência. Tem algumas situações em que isso não é o melhor para uma conversa, né? Então, se a pessoa é agressiva, se a pessoa é distante, como é que eu vou conseguir? Assim, não vai evoluir a conversa se eu encontrar ela onde ela tá. O que faz, então?
So matching does not necessarily mean mimicry, right? If you're angry, if I respond angry back to you, it's not going to make things better, or it's going to make things worse. Or think about the time when you ask someone, how are you doing? And they say, oh, my aunt passed away last week. The wrong thing to say is, oh, I know exactly what that feels like. I had a pet that died 7 years ago, right? That's not the right thing but that's because matching doesn't mean mimicry. Matching means acknowledging. So if you're angry, sometimes it's just a matter of me saying, it seems like you're really upset and I want to understand why. That's matching. I'm showing you that I'm hearing you. I'm showing you that I want to be on the same frequency as you. If you tell me that your aunt passed away, sometimes the best thing to say is, oh, I'm so sorry. Like, what was she like? Tell me about your aunt.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And that doesn't mean that I'm telling you a story about myself. It doesn't mean that I'm mimicking you, that I'm having exactly the same experience, but it means that I'm proving to you that I'm listening, I'm acknowledging, and I'm saying I'm willing to stay on the frequency that you are on right now, even if imitating you is not the right thing to do.
Perfeito. Agora eu vou te fazer uma pergunta que a gente escuta bastante por causa da comunicação não violenta, que é: legal, li seu livro, peguei todas as práticas e eu vou levar para minha vida. Não corro o risco de parecer manipulador? De parecer não autêntico?
Yeah. So it's a good question because I think sometimes we misunderstand what communication is. Communication is a set of tools, right? And think about an axe as a tool. An axe is a tool that you can use to cut down trees and build a house, or it's a tool you can use to go murder someone, right? The tool itself isn't good or bad. It's the person who's holding the tool. And so you're exactly right. How do we make sure that we're not coming across as manipulative? How do we make sure that we aren't actually manipulative? The best way to do this is just to be as honest as possible with ourselves and with others. Because the way that our brains have evolved, we have a hair trigger reaction to manipulation and inauthenticity. And this makes sense. This makes sense because if you think about it, in a state of nature, if we lived in a village, if someone walks into town and they say, I'm a friend, you can trust me, and it turns out they're lying, they're manipulating us, that's incredibly dangerous. They could kill everyone. So as a result, we're always suspicious a little bit that the other person is trying to manipulate us. So how do we overcome that? Oftentimes the way we overcome it is by telling the person, look, I'm going to make an argument to you, but what's really important to me is understanding what you think about it. And I want to try and understand you. Before a conversation, oftentimes we think about all the things we want to say, right? We think about, I want to convince you that I'm right. I want to convince you to go on vacation to this place. I want to convince you to give me a raise. But we don't spend as much time thinking about, what do I hope the other person will say? What question should I ask the other person that's really important to this discussion? When we put ourselves in the position where we force ourselves to think about what the other person is thinking about, it almost becomes impossible for us to manipulate. Because our goal is not just to convince them of something. It's not just to say our piece. It's to hear what they think about the world. And in fact, there was a study that was done by Harvard Business School where they had a bunch of new students coming into the school, and they told all of them, okay, in a couple of minutes, you're going to have a conversation with a stranger. And this is like the most anxiety producing thing you're going to ask people to have, right? You have a conversation with a stranger. And they said, but before you have the conversation, we want you to do one thing. We want you to write down 3 topics you might want to talk about, or 3 questions you might want to ask. Simple things like, are you going to the party this weekend? Did you see that movie?
Mm-hmm.
Take 10 seconds, write this down. So everyone does it. They write it down. They stick the questions in their pocket. And then afterwards they ask them, did those questions come up? And everyone said, no, the questions never came up. The topics never came up. But I felt so much more relaxed in that conversation. The conversation went so much better than I thought it was going to go. When we try and anticipate how a conversation will unfold, and particularly not just the conversation we want to have, but the conversation they want to have, that's how we overcome that suspicion of manipulation and that instinct that sometimes we have to manipulate.
Eu acho que muito do que você falou hoje depende da gente se manter curioso e interessado pelo outro. E eu acho que esse é uma habilidade, uma emoção, não sei, um pouco em falta, short supply. Como você tem alguma inspiração de como a gente pode se manter curioso, se manter interessado pelo que o outro pensa, sente?
I think the first thing is, it's okay if sometimes you're not curious, right? Sometimes we get into the Uber and we don't want to talk to the driver. We just want to check our email, and that's okay. But during those moments when curiosity is important, one of the things that's interesting is when our curiosity is pricked, it's very easy to pay attention to, right? Nobody gets bored in the middle of a joke if they like the joke. It's not hard for you to pay attention to a TV show if you like that TV show. And usually you like that TV show because you don't know what's going to come next. Usually you like that joke because you don't know what the punchline is and you're waiting for it. Curiosity is a natural state for humans. When we forget it, when we extinguish it, it's because we're so focused on ourselves that we're not paying attention to what's going on around us. And there's times when we have to be focused on ourselves. There's times when I just want to check my email. I just want to lay in bed. I just want to relax. But the other times, if we just take a moment and just look around, we will find something that sparks our curiosity, right? Sometimes just asking the simplest question. Do you like being an Uber driver? What's it like?
Uhum.
They say something interesting in response. And then suddenly, it's not like you have to work to be curious.
Uhum.
You're interested. And the same thing is true of us. When we speak, we should say interesting things. When someone says, how's your day? Instead of saying, oh, it's fine, it's good. Saying, actually, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. I was on vacation last week and I'm excited to get back to work. Then we're sparking their curiosity. The curiosity, I think, is the easiest thing to spark if we prioritize it, if we look for it.
Perfeito. Vamos terminar só com as suas dicas culturais. Vamos saber quem influencia a pessoa que nos influencia tanto. Fala pra gente um livro, o último livro que você leu que explodiu sua cabeça.
Oh, that's a great question. Let me think for a second. I'll mention two books.
Mm.
One that I love that I read a long time ago and one that I just read recently. So there's this book named The Varieties of Religious Experience by William James.
Uhum.
William James is the father of American psychology. He was like one of the first psychologists. And he had this question, which was, why do people feel a need to believe in religion? Right? What is it about religion that inspires so many people to come to church or to have a relationship with God?
Uhum.
And what he argued is that it's actually very different for different people. That there are some people, for instance, who belong to the religion of healthy-mindedness. They're just optimistic. And the reason they're optimistic is because they want to be optimistic. There are other people who believe deeply in God and God's role on earth and in their life. And one of the things that makes that belief real is that they want God to be real. And this is true of everything in life. The things that we see, the things that we believe, the things that we hear are shaped by what we hope is true. And that doesn't mean that they're always true. I hope that my person will win the election. I hope that your person will lose the election, and sometimes your person wins.
Uhum.
But understanding how our beliefs influence how we see things is really, really important. The second book is a little bit easier.
Mm.
It's called Void Star. It's about artificial intelligence. It's a novel.
Uhum.
And it was written by a computer programmer. And it's about what is the experience of being artificial intelligence. And I love this book. It's a great book. I don't know if it's been translated into Portuguese, but if so, everyone should read it.
Muito bom. A última série que você ficou apaixonado.
Oh, now you're getting into the really good questions. There's this, wait, what is the last show that I like? Well, recently I've been rewatching House of Cards. Oh, actually, I know the show I love, The Wire. Do you know the show, The Wire?
Yeah.
I love The Wire. The Wire is great. And as a journalist, it was written by a journalist. I love it.
Newsroom, didn't you like it?
Yeah, I wasn't so into Newsroom. How about you? Did you like Newsroom?
Yes.
Yeah, you did? Okay, maybe I should give it another chance. Maybe I should try it again.
Que música você gosta de ouvir?
So I'm turning 50 in a couple of weeks, and we're going to have a dance party in Palm Springs. So I've been making a playlist for my friends so that we can have a dance party. And a song that I love is Superstition by Stevie Wonder. It's a great song. Yeah.
Great song.
What about you, though? What's your favorite song?
Eu gosto muito dos Strokes. E eu tava ouvindo hoje de manhã o Tiny Desk. Eu amo Tiny Desk.
God, it's a great
Amo,
song, isn't
amo.
it?
E, não, o show da NPR, o Tiny Desk, eles levam artistas novos e tal. E tem uma cantora que eu amo, que tava ouvindo do Michael Kiwanuka, que eu amo, e o da Joy Oladokun. Amo. É lindo, lindo, lindo.
Really?
Lindo, adoro.
Oh, that's wonderful. It's so much fun when you find new music. Can I ask you the book question? What's your favorite book? What's the book that...
Eu tava falando hoje ainda de que isso é uma pergunta impossível. Preferido eu não sei, eu vou dizer os últimos livros. Eu amo os livros do Sandel. sabe? Justiça, o que o dinheiro não compra, meritocracia. Eu amo Irving Yalom,
Hmm.
sabe? Quando Nietzsche chorou e tal, ele escreveu um livro sobre luto que ele coescreve com a esposa, tá? Eles têm um casamento, sei lá, 70 anos e ela tem um diagnóstico de câncer que é terminal.
Oh, I think I heard.
Cada um escreve um capítulo, no meio ela morre e ele continua escrevendo. É a coisa mais bonita que você já viu na vida, é lindo esse livro. E, eu amo, como chama? Novela histórica, sabe? Ficção histórica. Então o Coen e Goulden, como chama? Ken Follett. Eu
Yeah.
amo esses livros, adoro.
I love those too.
E eu
Yeah.
com certeza tô fazendo injustiças gigantescas de livros maravilhosos que eu li
It's
recentemente.
impossible, right? It's so hard to choose one book. But I know, it's such a joy to like find new books that you love.
E eu gosto de livros que eu não gosto também. Então, por exemplo, eu detestei o livro A Cachorra, da Pilar. Odiei.
Oh, yeah.
Péssimo livro. Porque ele é ótimo e ele faz eu sentir coisas que eu não gostaria de sentir, eu não gostaria que existissem. Eu não sei por que ela tem que apertar as pessoas nesses lugares, entendeu? Por que ela tem que provocar isso nas pessoas? Péssima pessoa. Então ele é um ótimo livro. O Walter Ugumãe eu amo também, o Água à Luz eu amo também. Ixi, livro, assim, a gente pode fazer um programa só sobre isso. Você volta aqui e a gente fala só sobre livro, pode ser, né?
Okay, good. Come back. That sounds good.
Então, muito obrigada, foi um prazer te receber. Eu espero que a sua estada aqui no Brasil seja uma delícia.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been so much fun. And I will say, I love coming to Brazil. I love the country because it's so beautiful, but most importantly, the people are just wonderful. They're so friendly, they're so open. It's a great country, particularly if you like conversations.
Obrigada, que ótimo. Gente, muito obrigada para quem ficou com a gente até aqui. Você já sabe, você é o melhor algoritmo, é você que vai fazer chegar esse conteúdo nos seus amigos. Muito obrigada e até semana que vem.
Mamilos Café.